Hello and welcome to the second part of Chord Melody Ukulele. If you haven't seen the first part, probably a good idea to spend a few minutes and have a look at that one, because particularly we're going to have a look at the tune we learned last time just briefly at the beginning to open up another way of thinking about playing chord melody ukulele, and we're going to then use that to dive into the tune that we're going to learn today, which is the old favourite 5'2" Eyes of Blue, which you may already know how to play. Now you might have noticed that when we played Dirty Old Town, we basically played a bit of melody and then a chord, and a bit of melody and then a chord, and that was fairly easy to do because the melody was all hiding in the chord shape, so we could play and then just carry on strumming. We're already holding it, and just lift up the odd finger. And that's one approach to playing chord melody, and you'll find as we go on that there are different approaches, and we'll talk about two different ways of doing part of this tune today. The thing is, in reality, you'll probably use bits of all the different approaches and pick out the bits that work best in different sections of the tune or in a particular style or in a particular piece. So you don't have to stick to one way of playing. So here's an example of that now. We could have played Dirty Old Town a little bit differently. We could have done this. Now that was a very subtle difference. The way it was written was this. And what I played just then was this. Yep, instead of just playing that note on the top string as part of the melody, I actually strummed all four strings. And that's because we tend to hear the highest note of a chord as the melody note. Well, the note we want to play for the melody is the highest note of this G chord. So if instead of just playing that one note, I play the whole chord, we'll still get the same effect. We'll still hear that melody note as the melody, plus we have a chord behind it. So that's a really important principle of playing chord melody, is this is where we find chords all over the fingerboard, because all these different arrangements of notes making the same chord in different positions, what they're doing is they're jumbling up the notes in the chord so we can put the one we want to hear as the melody note at the top. And then suddenly, as if by magic, this bunch of chords has a melody in there. We also don't have to play all four strings to get that effect. So if I go back to Dirty Old Town again, the note here on the second string, I could play the other two strings below the second string when we hear that one, but not the first string, because that would put another note higher than the melody. So I could go strum 3 strings, then strum 4 strings. I'll do it again. And we still hear the melody. I can't really do it on the note on the third string, though if you have a low fourth, you could. The reason I can't really get a good effect there is because if I strum just 2 strings, my high fourth string becomes the highest note, and so we don't know what we're supposed to be listening to. Are we picking this melody note or is this the melody note? And that's not going to work as well. But if you had a low fourth, you could strum 2 strings, then 3, then 4, and you'd have a chord on every melody note, and it would be the same chord because G is the chord that's happening at that moment, but you'd have a different melody note on top of it. And that's something we're going to explore when we look at 5'2" Eyes of Blue. Now this song, you might be able to play it already. If it's in your Ukulele Club songbook, it's probably in the key of C. And if it was in the key of C, it would go like this. C, E7, A7, D7, G7, and C. And there's a bridge to the song as well, but it actually just uses some of those same chords. It's quite a common song for ukulele players to play. The only thing is, when I came to look at making a chord melody arrangement of this, the key of C wasn't a great key. Here's another important principle of chord melody arranging. The key you already know it in, or the key it's written in a songbook, might not be the best key for it to work as a chord melody arrangement. Why is that? Well, we've already hinted at it. We're trying to keep the melody on the highest string as much as we can because that gives us more opportunity to play notes below it in the chord. And if the key it's in ends up with the melody going right up here, that's going to be really quite difficult. It might even go off the end of the fretboard, and that's no good. But if it's too low a key, our melody's going to come down. Okay, the second string's not too bad, but if we have a lot of melody down on the second and onto the third string, we're not going to be able to get enough of a chord happening underneath it. On top of that, some keys might be feasible, but they might just be really horrible to try and stretch and reach those chords. I played around with it and I found the key of F is a really nice key to play it in, and actually the chords are not difficult at all. It all sits very nicely. So let's have a play through the chords. If you don't know the tune 5 foot 2, now would be a good time to pause this video and go and listen to the song 5 foot 2, because that's another important principle of when you're learning chord melody. If you're learning from the tablature, you really need to have in your head what this piece of music sounds like. If you just dive straight in and start following numbers on lines on the tablature without knowing what the song sounds like quite clearly in your own head, then that's going to be a very difficult thing to do. So if you don't know it, go and find a recording of it. You'll be able to find thousands of them on YouTube. And then we'll play along, and I'll sing little bits of the lyric as well so that you know where we are. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4. 5 foot 2, that's an F, A7, eyes of blue, D7. Oh, what those 5 feet can do, G7. Has anybody C7 seen my girl? Now this F is the first time ending, then a C7, and we go back to the beginning. Da, 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 A7, do the same thing again. G7. Anybody C7 seen my girl? Second time ending, which carries on into the bridge. If you run into A7, a 5 foot 2, D7, covered in furs, G7, diamond rings, all those things, C7, bet your life it isn't her. And this bit is the same as the first bit again. So we've got an idea of how it goes, and if you've ever strummed this song before, you'll find that quite familiar, but also, as I said earlier, you might find that it's not in the key that you were used to playing it in. You might also notice that that's a little bit high for me to sing, and if I was going to sing it, I probably wouldn't play it in that key, but for chord melody, it's going to work a treat. So now we know what the song sounds like, and we've found the chords, and those chord shapes, as before, are going to play a big part in being able to play the melody at the same time as the chords. We're going to be using familiar chord shapes, but in this one we're going to focus more on trying to play a chord on every single melody note of the piece. So with the 2 bits of tablature that you've downloaded, we're looking at version 1 right now, where we're really going to try and make a chord on every single melody note. Version 2 we'll look at in a moment. Another reason why this song is really good to look at is the melody is very strong and it follows these little motifs, these little patterns, and we can look at that and see how it lays out on the fingerboard, and you see it's very, very clever. Our first chord is an F, and the melody note at this point is the A note on our first string. So that's nice and handy. We can strum all of those, but we'll hear this A note as the melody because it's the highest one. The melody then goes to the 3rd fret of that same first string. I'm going to use my little finger. I keep hold of the F and I add my little finger on the 3rd fret. Now that is also an F chord. The note we've added here, well, we haven't added anything. That's the note of C. There's already a C in an F chord. It's our open C string. We've just replaced that A on the top. And we can, because guess what? We've got 2 of those. We've got a doubled up A. Instead of a doubled up A, if we put our little finger down, we now have a doubled up C. But that C is a higher octave than that C. They're an octave apart. And that one is the highest note, so we're going to hear that as the melody. And what we do is this. So for that first bar, we've played 4 F chords, but one of them we rearranged the notes so that instead of an A on the top, we had a C on the top. That's our first bar. The next bar is an A7 chord, and the melody note with the A7 chord is again the A on the first string. And it's going to do exactly the same thing as we did with the F chord, but we can't go up to the 3rd fret. That note does not belong in an A7 chord. But the one at the 4th fret, C sharp, does. We had a C sharp, still got a C sharp, down here under our index finger. But we are now moving it and putting a C sharp on the top as well. So the same rhythm, this is why it's such a strong tune. It does the same thing over each chord. So now we have A7, then we put down our little finger on the 4th fret of the first string and then take it off. So far we've got this. The next chord is a D7, and we're going to play it with 2 fingers like this, the sort of often called the Hawaiian D7, 2 open, 2 open. And the reason we're doing that is, yep, you guessed it, the melody note again is that open A string. And it's going to go up. Now the first time when we played F, it went up to the 3rd fret. The next time we played A7, it went up to the 4th fret. Any guesses where it's going to go this time? Yep, it's going to go up to the 5th fret. And the note at the 5th fret is a D. Well, a D note, of course that fits in a D7 chord. It's the note the chord is named after. So we can play our D7 here, and then a bit of a stretch, but put your little finger on the 5th fret of the first string. And it does a little bit of a different thing here. It does the same pattern, but repeats it. So we get open, 5th fret, open, 5th fret, open, 5th fret, open, 5th fret, for 2 whole bars. So now we have this. And that's the first line done. So now we have a G7 chord. The only problem is our melody's gone right up here now. We need to play a G7 chord with the melody at the 8th fret. Well, if we take a D7, but this time the barred D7, where we hold that one down at the 2nd fret and this finger plays the 3rd fret on the first string, that's a D7. If we were to slide that all the way up the neck until we were barring the 7th, and this is at the 8th, we have a G7 with the right melody note at the top. Okay, so now we have a melody note that needs to go, and then it needs to go down to the 5th fret. Anybody. That's from the Anybody Seen My Girl bit. Anybody. But the chord doesn't change. But we need to change melody note. So we're going to go from a G7 here, and we're going to move to a G7 here. Now this G7 is kind of like an E7 chord shape, but if I play that with the wrong 3 fingers, not with my first 3, but I get rid of that one and switch everything along a finger so that I've got that E7 shape, and then I slide it up and put this finger down on the 3rd fret. The other way to think of it is if you know an F7 chord down here, a 4-finger F7 chord, it's just that 2 frets higher. Now we still have a G7 chord, but we have a different melody note at the top. Now this is a tricky bit, and this is something we're going to come back to and find a different approach to this. So if you find this little section of the tune quite tricky, there's going to be version 2 of the tab that will come back. This is where it differs and where we can actually use a different approach to get through a tricky bit of the tune. But for now, see if you can do this. That's our barred 7th fret G7, 7, 7, 7, 8. And then our G7 down here, 4, 5, 3, 5. And we have to go back and forth. Anybody. That's quite tricky to do, but it'll certainly get you moving around your chord inversions. From there, we need to go to a C7 chord, and we want to have a C on the top. Now that C7 chord that we all know, that's no good because that's the wrong melody note. So let's play it like this. Bar the 3rd fret and put this finger down on the 3rd string up 4th fret. It's just an A7 chord, moved up 3 frets. And that's our C7, and we have the right melody note on the top there. Now we have to use a melody note here that doesn't belong in the chord. It goes nicely with the chord, but it isn't one of the notes in the chord. And that will happen. It happened in Dirty Old Town, if you remember. We had a G, but we had this note where we had to lift our finger off. That note is not a note that belongs in a G chord. It's not one of the ones we hold down, but it goes nicely with it. And here's one now. We take that C7 and we're going to use our ring finger to add the 5th fret on the A string, the 1st string, for seen my. And that actually will transform that chord from a C7 to a C9, but that's not really changing what the chord's function is. It's just adding a melody note to a chord. And then we go back to our basic F, and our melody note is where we started on the 1st string A. So let's see what we've got so far. And then there's a C7. And we hit the repeat marks. Now every single thing I played there was all 4 strings of my ukulele. I was playing chords. Yes, some of those chord shapes were moved around, and in one case I was adding an extra note to a chord, but we were playing chords, and yet it sounded like we could hear the melody. So those repeats send us back to the beginning. So we go, same as before, right up until we get to that 1st time ending. Here, well, it's not the 1st time anymore, so we skip these 2 bars and we jump ahead to the 2nd time ending on the next line where the number 2 is. And it's an F chord, but a different inversion of an F chord with a higher note on the top. And that's because the 1st time when we play this, it goes, we're singing it, anybody seen my girl. And the 2nd time round it goes, anybody seen my girl. It goes up at the end, so we have an F there, which is just like a C chord shape, but instead of the nut here we put a finger down and we slide it up to the 5th fret and we have 5, 5, 5, 8, and that's an F chord, and the note on the top is an F. So that seems nice and happy and resolved. We've got the note name of the chord, the root name of the chord there on the top, and everyone's happy. It's like a full stop on the end. Now, because we went to the 2nd time ending and skipped the 1st time ending, we've also hopped over those repeats. So instead of going back anywhere, we just keep on going. So when we get to the next chord, the A7, we're into the bridge of the song. So from the 2nd time ending, anybody see my girl? And we just fill up space with that F chord. And the melody note at this point is still going to be that one. If I was singing it, I would go, anybody see my girl? Well, if you... So there's still the same melody note, it hasn't changed. If you... And now we have an A7. Now this A7 is just like the G7 we had earlier, but 2 frets higher. So this finger is at the 5th fret of the 2nd string, and that kind of looks like an F shape, and then we put these 2 in on the 7th fret. Now we don't have to leap around chord shapes like we had last time. When we were doing the G7, we were doing... That was really hard to do, and as I said before, we'll sort of fix that in a moment. But if we go to that A7, all we have to do to get the melody to work here is to get the highest note, the one our little finger is on, and we're going to move that up 2 frets. Like that. So what we do is we play A7 up to the 9th, back down again, and 2 more, and then we do it again. Okay, so that's not too bad. So from the 2nd time ending we have lots of Fs. Okay, then we go to a D7, and this time we want to have a D7 with a higher note at the top than we had down there. So we're actually going to play this D7, which is just like the C7 we had earlier, but moved up. So we're borrowing the 5th fret and playing the 3rd string at the 6th fret. Little trick here though, instead of adding a finger to the note that's already in the chord once we've played it, we're going to add the finger first, then take it off. So we're going to do the same thing we did with the C. We added a note here with our ring finger. We're going to do the same thing. It's going to be at the 7th fret, but we put it on straight away, then take it off. So that top note is going 7, 5, 7, 5. So this is what we've got so far. We have our F leading us into the bridge. Little finger goes up and down. And then we just fill up a bar with that D7 shape there without that finger on. And then we're going to do exactly the same thing that we just did on our A7, but 2 frets lower. So we go to our G7 down here, and we're going to slide the little finger up and down again from the 5th to the 7th. So we've just recycled something we've used before. This is one of the reasons this is such a great song to look at. It has such a strong melody that uses, for its material, repeating little motifs that happen over different chords, this same little up and down motion, and most of the notes are within the chords, and those that aren't are a short reach away. So all we've got to do now is bring the bridge to a close, and the good news is that once we've done that, the rest of the tune you've already done because it's the same as the section we started with, the A section. So we've got to that G7. Now we need to have a little bit that gets us back to the bridge, which is the bet your life it isn't her, that bit. So we go up for a C7, which is open 7, 6, 7. It looks just like a G7 chord shape, but we've slid it up till our index finger is at the 6th fret. Now we've got the melody note right up on the 7th fret of our 1st string. And what we do is we take our little finger and we stretch to the 10th fret. We keep those fingers down. And it does that same idea again of playing a chord, raising a note up, bringing that note back down again. This really strong little motif that goes all the way through the tune. The last note of this bar, we need a C chord with a C on top. Well, that's just our basic old C chord. So we can just play a regular C chord, and then the melody goes down to this note, the 1st fret on that string. So down to a C7, the next melody note is A, so we can play our C chord with the A on top by playing just all of the strings open. It's actually a C6 chord, but really it's a C chord with an A melody note. And for the first time in the tune, we're going to play fewer than all 4 strings, because our melody at this point just dips down below that open A string onto the next string down. And it's the G on the 3rd fret of the 2nd string. So what we want to do is to strum just 3 strings and not our 1st string. That's the only time we have to do it in the tune, because the rest of the melody all happens on that 1st string. So here's the bridge all the way through from the beginning of the 2nd time ending. So we have that F chord. Here we go. If you run into 5 foot 2. And we have a double bar line, which means we've finished the B section and we're back into the A section, which is exactly what we did before. So this is all old stuff you've done before. And we finish with that high F there at the end. Now if you wanted to go round and do the song multiple times, you could do the 1st time ending, or, well, a bit of a compromise between the 2nd time and the 1st time ending. You could play the high F from the 2nd time ending and then just play a C7 and go back to the beginning and loop round as many times as you wanted. Now you might be thinking, okay, that sounds more or less like 5'2", but there are a few things that don't seem quite right. And that's because there are two things that I've done here. One of them is I've kind of simplified the rhythm to make it nice and easy to play. And in a future lesson, we're going to look at how you can take something like this, which is fairly skeletal. It's a sort of scaffolding of a piece, and you can bring it to life off the page. That's something we're going to look at in a future lesson. The other thing is, the melody I've got here, I felt the same. I've sung this for years, and when I came to do this by ear, I was finding melody notes that I thought were correct, but I knew I had some very old sheet music of this song. I'll put up a picture of it now. And so I went through the sheet music and looked at what the melody was, and actually the melody I've just played you is the one that was taken from the sheet music. And again, when we come to looking at finding the source of the music to make your own arrangements, that's something we're going to look at in a future lesson. But what it showed me was that this bit, now if you run into a 5'2", I was singing it like this, run into a 5'2", right up there. But the sheet music has it, so I went with what was written on the sheet music. But that's often the case. Songs get played and they get rearranged and things get changed over the years, so that the thing that you might hear somebody playing now, they learned from somebody who learned it from somebody who learned it from somebody who then originally got it maybe from the sheet music. So these things do change over time. And you can make your own artistic judgments about that. I just decided to go back to the source and get the melody from the sheet music that I had. Okay, before we do a final playthrough, let's just have a look at version 2 of the tab. All that's changed in version 2 is that tricky little bit at the beginning of the second line of the tune, where we had to go from a G7 at the 7th fret, 7, 7, 7, 8, down to the G7, 4, 5, 3, 5, and back again. That anybody seen, that little bit, which is quite tricky, and it's a different way of approaching that. Now all I was doing was finding the melody note on the first string, and then finding a chord that had that melody note on the top, the right chord. So G7 with this melody note and G7 with that melody note. But maybe we could find that note somewhere else in the chord and not move chord position, just maybe put a finger down and play 3 strings instead of 4. And we can play. So what I did there was I played that same G7, 7, 7, 7, 8, and then instead of going here to get this melody note, I found that melody note on the 2nd string, 10th fret, with my little finger. So let me show you that. I went from there, and then I put my little finger down on the 10th fret, 2nd string, and I only play 3 strings, not that one. So I go like this, anybody, and then I can go straight to the next bar. So instead of this, I get this. Now you might find one is much easier to play than the other, or you might find you like the sound of one better than the other. It's up to you which one you pick. As with all of these kind of things, this is not a definitive way of doing it. This is the art of getting something off a piece of paper or from out of your head onto the 4 strings of the ukulele. So we have to find the way that works for us. We have to make compromises. We have to see what we can do with what we've got. So it's up to you. You can try this one or this one. There are no other differences in the 2 versions of the tablature. So whichever one you've got, pick one and let's do a playthrough together. It doesn't matter which one I'm playing, because both of those 2 bits will work together, because ultimately we're playing the same melody note and the same chord. So whichever one of those 2 ways of doing it you pick will work with someone doing the other one. I'm going to play version 1, but feel free to do that little bit from version 2 instead of jumping around if you want. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4. top. Second time ending. Here comes the bridge. Same as the first bit. Now this is quite a tough piece to get, particularly if you want to get it up to speed, but it's a great example of how you can do chord melody with full chords, most of the time 4 strings with the melody on the top, and it's really good for getting you moving around the fingerboard, playing different chord inversions to put that highest note on the top. I hope you've enjoyed this, hope it's helped, and I'll see you again soon. Bye bye.